I'm 95 years old, and when you reach this age, people don't ask you about your plans anymore. They ask you what you've learned. They look at you like you're carrying some hidden truth, something distilled from decades of living. I used to think wisdom came automatically with age. It doesn't. What comes with age is perspective, but only if you're willing to look back honestly. I've watched friends build empires and die dissatisfied. I've watched others live simple lives and leave this world at peace. That difference has nothing to do with intelligence or luck. It has everything to do with what they believed would make them happy. And that's why I need you to hear this carefully. The things you're chasing right now might not be the things that will fulfill you. And the sooner you understand that, the more of your life you get to actually live. When I was young, I believed happiness was waiting at the next milestone. I told myself I'd relax after I earned enough money. I'd enjoy my family more after I secured stability. I'd slow down once I proved I wasn't average. But proving yourself is a trap, because once you prove one thing, you look for the next thing to prove. I spent decades measuring my worth through achievement. Promotions felt like validation. Recognition felt like confirmation. And every time I climbed higher, I expected that quiet emptiness inside me to disappear. It didn't. It just changed shape. It became more subtle, more disguised. I didn't realize I wasn't chasing success. I was chasing a feeling. The feeling of being enough. And I thought the world had to give me that permission. I remember sitting in my office at 52, door closed, staring out the window at a city I once dreamed of conquering. I had the title, the income, the authority. People stood up when I walked into meetings. But inside that room, alone, I felt strangely hollow. Not depressed, not broken, just unfinished. And that confused me, because no one prepares you for the possibility that success might not deliver what it promised. We are raised to believe that if we work hard enough, sacrifice long enough, and endure pressure quietly, fulfillment will eventually reward us. But fulfillment is not a trophy handed to you after enough suffering. It is something built internally, long before the trophies arrive. The first wake-up call didn't come from losing money or status. It came from losing presence. My daughter once told me, calmly, not angrily, "Dad, you're here, but you're not really here." That sentence unsettled me more than any professional failure ever had, because she was right. I was physically at the dinner table, but mentally reviewing emails. Physically at her school events, but emotionally preoccupied. I had convinced myself that providing financially was the highest form of love. But love isn't measured in income. It's measured in attention. And attention cannot be backdated. Once a moment passes without it, it's gone. That realization still sits heavy in me. For years I told myself I was doing it all for them, for my family, for their security, for their future. And in many ways that was true. But what I failed to admit was that part of me also needed the applause. I needed to feel admired, needed to feel important. There's a subtle difference between responsibility and ego, and if you're not careful, they blend together. I worked 60-hour weeks and called it dedication. I missed anniversaries and called it sacrifice. I skipped quiet evenings at home and called it ambition. But ambition without awareness becomes a slow erosion. Not dramatic, not explosive, just gradual distance. The kind of distance that grows between you and the people you love while you're busy convincing yourself you're doing the right thing. Around my early 60s, something shifted. Not externally, internally. I started attending more funerals than weddings. That alone changes you. Standing beside a casket strips away illusions quickly. No one talks about stock portfolios. No one mentions square footage. They talk about warmth, about laughter, about how someone made them feel seen. and I began to ask myself a question I had avoided for decades. If I were the one lying there, what would they say about me? Would they talk about my titles, or would they talk about my presence? That question lingered. It followed me home. It followed me into quiet evenings, and it forced me to confront a truth I didn't want to face. I had invested heavily in building a life, but I had underinvested in being alive inside it. Fear played a bigger role in my decisions than I ever admitted. Fear of not being respected, fear of financial instability, fear of becoming irrelevant. The irony is that the more I achieved, the more refined my fears became. They didn't disappear, they upgraded. Instead of worrying about survival, I worried about status. Instead of fearing poverty, I feared decline. Fear is clever like that. It adapts. And unless you recognize it, it will quietly steer your entire life. I thought once I reached a certain threshold, I would finally feel safe. But safety built on external circumstances is fragile. One market shift, one diagnosis, one unexpected event, and it collapses. Real stability had to come from somewhere deeper. Let me ask you something gently. What are you postponing right now? What conversation have you delayed because you think there will be a better time? What rest are you denying yourself because you believe you haven't earned it yet? I postponed joy for decades. I postponed stillness. I postponed self-reflection. And if anything I'm saying feels familiar to you, take a moment and think about it honestly. You don't have to answer publicly unless you want to, but sometimes writing it down in the comments makes it real. Reflection is uncomfortable, but it is powerful. And if these conversations help you slow down enough to examine your own life, that alone makes them worth continuing. In my 70s, I began shedding layers I didn't realize I was carrying. The need to impress, the need to compete, the need to win invisible comparisons that only existed in my head. I started noticing how much mental energy I had spent measuring myself against others. Who had more? Who retired earlier? Who seemed happier? Comparison quietly poisons contentment. It convinces you that your life is inadequate simply because someone else's appears polished. But polished is not peaceful. I've known wealthy men who were deeply restless, and modest men who were profoundly at ease. Peace is not tied to possessions. It is tied to alignment. Alignment means your outer life reflects your inner values. For most of my adulthood, there was a gap between the two. I valued connection, yet prioritized productivity. I valued family, yet rewarded myself for overtime. I valued health, yet ignored my body's warnings. That gap creates tension, and tension, when ignored, becomes regret. Regret isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet awareness that you traded something irreplaceable for something replaceable. Time with your children for extra income, presence for prestige, rest for recognition. These trades feel reasonable in the moment. Only later do you realize the exchange rate was unfair. There is a misconception that growing older automatically makes you wise. It doesn't. Some people age without evolving. They become rigid, bitter, defensive. Others soften. They reflect. They adjust. The difference isn't years lived, it's years examined. I had to confront parts of myself I didn't like. My impatience, my pride, my attachment to being seen as capable. Letting go of those identities felt like losing armor, but it also felt like relief, because maintaining an image is exhausting. Authenticity is lighter. It doesn't require constant maintenance. One truth I learned later than I wish I had is this: your worth does not increase with productivity. You are not a machine. You are not a resume. You are not a title. And yet, I built my self-esteem as if I were. When productivity slowed, I felt exposed. as if without output I had no value. That belief is deeply ingrained in many of us, especially men of my generation. We were taught that usefulness equals importance, but usefulness fades, strength declines, roles change. If your identity is built solely on what you do, aging feels like erasure. If your identity is built on who you are, aging feels like refinement. By the time I reached my 80s, I had less energy, but far more clarity. I no longer cared about appearing impressive. I cared about being honest. Honest about what I felt. Honest about what I needed. Honest about what I no longer wanted to tolerate. That honesty changed my relationships. Some people drifted away when I stopped performing the version of myself they were comfortable with, and that hurt at first. But what replaced them were deeper connections, relationships built on truth instead of expectation. I realized that loneliness is not the absence of people, it is the absence of authenticity. When you live in alignment with who you truly are, even quiet moments feel full. If I could sit across from my 40-year-old self right now, I wouldn't tell him to stop dreaming. I wouldn't tell him to abandon ambition. I would tell him to pay attention. Pay attention to how his body feels when he's constantly stressed. Pay attention to the look in his child's eyes when he's distracted. Pay attention to the quiet voice inside that whispers, "This isn't sustainable." We override that voice because we think endurance equals strength. But endurance without reflection becomes self-neglect. Strength is not how much pressure you can withstand. Strength is knowing when to adjust your path before the pressure breaks something that cannot be repaired. The phrase, "before it's too late," sounds dramatic when you're young. It feels distant, abstract. But as you age, it becomes tangible. You start noticing how many some days never happened. Trips postponed, conversations avoided, risks never taken. Not because you lacked ability, but because you assumed time would wait. Time does not wait. It does not slow down because you finally feel ready. It moves at the same pace, whether you're paying attention or not. And one morning you wake up and realize there are more memories behind you than opportunities ahead. That awareness is not depressing. It is clarifying. It forces you to prioritize what actually matters. So what do I want you to understand before it's too late? That fulfillment is not built on accumulation. It is built on attention. That peace is not earned through exhaustion. It is cultivated through alignment. That love requires presence, not just provision. And that the feeling of being enough does not come from the outside world granting you permission. It begins when you decide you are already worthy. If something in this reflection spoke to you, I'd genuinely like to know what lesson resonated the most. Share it in the comments. Your perspective might help someone else see their own life more clearly. And if you value conversations like this, slow, honest, grounded reflections from someone who has seen nearly a century of life, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. None of us knows how much time we have, but we do know this moment is here. Don't let it pass unnoticed.